Halloween night, 1968. 9 men crewed a single 105mm howitzer inside the wire at Fire Support Base Rita, dug into the Fishhook, a small finger of Cambodian border territory jutting into South Vietnam. They had no illusions about what that position meant. North Vietnamese regulars had been massing in the surrounding jungle for weeks, and every man on that gun crew understood exactly why Rita existed and exactly what it would cost the enemy to leave it standing. When the first mortar rounds began falling just after midnight, the crew didn't wait for orders. They loaded beehive. Thousands of North Vietnamese soldiers were about to learn, in the span of a single night, that a 9-man artillery crew with a direct-fire howitzer and nothing left to lose was not a target. It was a wall. To understand how that wall held, we have to go back to the reason Fire Support Base Rita existed in the first place, and the specific piece of terrain that made the North Vietnamese army decide it had to be destroyed. The Fishhook sat directly across the Cambodian border from Tay Ninh Province, a narrow, hooked salient of Cambodian territory that North Vietnamese forces used as a staging ground and infiltration route into South Vietnam's interior. American commanders built Fire Support Base Rita specifically to interdict that movement, positioning 105mm and 155mm howitzers within range of the trails and river crossings the North Vietnamese army depended on to move men and material south. From Hanoi's perspective, Rita wasn't simply an inconvenience. It was a direct threat to the entire logistics network feeding the war in South Vietnam's central provinces, and that made it a target the North Vietnamese army had every strategic reason to eliminate outright rather than simply route around. External security around Rita's perimeter fell to Bravo Troop, 1st Squadron, 4th Cavalry, riding M48 tanks and M113 armored personnel carriers. The armor gave the perimeter genuine protection against small arms and most conventional infantry assault, but it carried its own specific vulnerability. Rocket-propelled grenades, cheap and plentiful in North Vietnamese inventories, could punch straight through an M113's thin aluminum armor, and cavalry troopers patrolling the jungle outside the wire had already learned that lesson the hard way in the weeks before Halloween night arrived. Internal security, the guns themselves, belonged to the Redlegs of Charlie Battery, 8th Battalion, 6th Artillery Regiment, and 1st Battalion, 5th Artillery, crews who had spent the base's entire existence understanding that if the perimeter ever failed, their howitzers were the last defensive line left standing between the North Vietnamese army and an overrun position. Every 105mm howitzer crew in Vietnam trained on a round most artillerymen hoped they would never need to fire in earnest. The M546 beehive round carried 8,000 steel flechettes packed into a single shell, designed to be fired directly at an advancing enemy, rather than lobbed indirectly onto a map coordinate. A howitzer firing beehive stopped being an artillery piece in any conventional sense, and became, for the seconds that round was in the air, the largest shotgun in the entire American arsenal, converting a weapon built for indirect fire support into a direct-fire killing machine capable of clearing an entire advancing formation in a single shot. Doctrine called for green star cluster flares before every beehive round, a standard warning to any friendly troops still forward of the guns that direct fire was coming. On Halloween night, with North Vietnamese infantry already inside the wire in multiple places, there was no time left for warnings between shots. Fire support bases like Rita followed a defensive doctrine built around exactly this kind of last resort direct fire. Howitzers normally fired indirectly, arcing high explosive rounds onto map coordinates called in by forward observers miles away, a role that had nothing to do with defending the position where the gun itself actually sat. But every firebase in Vietnam maintained a secondary capability few artillerymen ever wanted to use in earnest. Direct fire, muzzle depressed level with the ground, aimed straight at whatever was crossing the wire, rather than an abstract grid reference somewhere over the horizon. That capability existed specifically for nights like this one, when the perimeter itself became the target rather than some distant enemy position the guns were meant to support. The M546 beehive round packed its 8,000 flechettes behind a mechanical time fuse, calibrated to eject the payload at a set distance from the muzzle, spreading the fragments into a cone wide enough to cover an entire advancing rank of infantry rather than a single point of impact. Fired often enough in succession, a battery of howitzers could theoretically maintain a nearly continuous wall of flechettes across a threatened sector, limited only by how quickly crews could load, aim, and fire the next round while under direct enemy contact themselves, with sappers and infantry sometimes reaching positions close enough that gun crews were fighting with rifles and pistols in the intervals between beehive rounds. The assault came in waves, mortars first, then sappers blowing gaps in the wire with Bangalore torpedoes, then infantry pouring through those gaps faster than the perimeter's defenders could reasonably track. Lieutenant Colonel Rogers, the battalion commander, made a decision that would define the entire battle. Rather than direct the fight from a command bunker, he moved to one of the guns himself and crewed it as an ordinary artillery private, pumping beehive rounds directly into North Vietnamese formations that filled every gap blown open in their own ranks with fresh reserves almost as fast as the howitzers could cut them down. Rogers was struck by shrapnel once and kept fighting. A second wound put him down entirely, and even then he refused to stop directing the defense, coordinating artillery fire and calling for air support from where he lay. What that 9-man crew and the batteries around them were actually facing became clear only as the fighting stretched past midnight and showed no sign of breaking. Wave after wave of North Vietnamese infantry continued advancing directly into beehive fire that should have, by any conventional infantry calculation, broken the assault after the first or second volley. It didn't. Reserve formations moved up to fill gaps torn open by flechettes with a discipline that spoke to exactly how much North Vietnamese commanders had committed to taking Rita that night, treating their own infantry losses as an acceptable cost against a fire support base they considered strategically intolerable to leave standing. Bravo! Troops, tankers, and cavalry scouts absorbed a disproportionate share of the night's danger, precisely because their vehicles, for all the protection armor plating offered against small arms, remained exactly as vulnerable to a well-placed rocket-propelled grenade as any softer target on the perimeter. Crews who lost vehicles to RPG hits in the opening hours of the assault often kept fighting from the wreckage or on foot alongside the infantry, since abandoning a defensive sector entirely was not something any unit at Rita treated as an option that night, whatever condition their equipment was left in by the fighting. Beehive rounds alone couldn't hold every meter of that perimeter, and North Vietnamese sappers exploited the gaps that opened wherever direct fire couldn't reach. Rocket-propelled grenades found several of Bravo troops' armored vehicles in exactly the manner cavalry troopers had already learned to fear, punching through thin aluminum hulls and turning armored protection into a liability in the confined chaos of a night assault fought at near point-blank range. The battle became, in its worst stretches, a fight for individual gun pits and vehicle positions rather than a coherent defense of a single perimeter line, with crews holding ground meter by meter until reinforcement or daylight arrived, whichever came first. This is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to dig up. The gun crew nobody expected to hold the line alone. If that's why you're still here, you already know what to do before the next one goes up. Daylight arrived first, and it arrived with the two things that finally broke the North Vietnamese assault for good. Air Force tactical jets reached the base as visibility improved enough for pilots to distinguish friendly positions from the attacking formations still pressing the wire, and Army helicopter gunships followed close behind, adding rocket and minigun fire to howitzer crews who had already been firing beehive rounds for hours without meaningful rest. Caught between direct artillery fire from guns that hadn't stopped firing all night and air support that could finally see clearly enough to engage, the last North Vietnamese formations broke contact and withdrew back toward the Cambodian border they had crossed the night before. 27 Americans were confirmed killed defending Fire Support Base Rita that night, A serious toll for a single engagement, but a fraction of what pilots reported seeing when they finally had daylight and altitude to survey the ground beyond the wire. Hundreds of North Vietnamese bodies lay in the open, where beehive fire and close air support had caught successive waves of an assault that never managed to fully overrun a single American gun position. Despite hours of sustained attack against a perimeter defended by artillerymen who had never expected to fight as frontline infantry, and did so anyway, because the alternative was losing the base entirely. The 9 men on any single howitzer crew trained for months on procedures built around indirect fire missions, range calculations, powder charges, azimuth adjustments called down from a fire direction center they might never see in person. None of that training fully prepared a crew for direct fire at near point-blank range against infantry, actively trying to overrun their own position. A scenario doctrine acknowledged as possible, but that most artillerymen genuinely hoped never to experience firsthand. Rita's crews experienced it anyway, adapting within minutes to a fight their training had prepared them for, only in theory, loading and firing beehive rounds at a rate that left little room for the kind of careful procedure a standard fire mission usually allowed. Lieutenant Colonel Rogers survived his wounds and the battle both, having spent a night that began as a battalion commander's responsibility and ended with him personally crewing a howitzer under fire rather than directing the fight from anywhere safer. The 9-man crews of Charlie Battery and 1st Battalion, 5th Artillery, held their guns through a night that tested exactly what a direct-fire howitzer crew could withstand when retreat wasn't an option, and the only alternative to holding the line was watching it collapse entirely. Fire Support Base Rita stood the next morning, exactly where American commanders had built it to interdict a trail the North Vietnamese army needed badly enough to spend hundreds of lives trying to take it back in a single night. And lost.